It's back. The House passes the Paul Ryan budget. This is another progressive show. So, the new Paul Ryan budget was passed today in the House. And if you all remember, the Ryan budget was pretty much, it was created by budget guru and Eddie Munster lookalike, Paul Ryan. Well, let me show you this. It's kind of uncanny here. Look at that. Now, I don't know about you, but I see the resemblance. It's kind of a funny picture, kind of a funny way to start the show, but nonetheless, uncanny, man. Anyway, so getting into the Paul Ryan budget. Now, for those who aren't familiar, the Paul Ryan budget consists entirely of cuts. Now, I'm going to get into some of these cuts right now, actually. But before I do that, I just want to say how ironic the name is for this budget. It's called the Path to Prosperity, but I see it as nothing more than a path to austerity. So that's what I'm going to call it. So, what's really changed since the last version? Not a whole lot, except that it's actually more draconian. There are more cuts. I want to get into, like I said, the details of Paul Ryan's plan to screw everybody, except for the very rich. And I say that because it's true, and I'm going to get into that later. I'm also going to get into the Democratic response budget to this bill. So, what does the Paul Ryan budget do? Some of the details are as follows. It cuts domestic spending by $800 billion. $800 billion, huge number. It cuts non-defense discretionary programs by over $1 trillion, and that's by over $1 trillion below the Budget Control Act caps. It turns Medicare into a coupon. No, I'm not kidding. Here you go, Grandma. Go shop around. And that's going to cut benefits. You know, the coupon, it doesn't increase in value. It turns Medicaid into a block grant program. So they block grant it to the states, and the states can do whatever they want with it. It cuts the top tax rate to 25%. 25%. The balls on these guys to sit there and cut taxes for the rich once again. Because right now, the rich are paying the least taxes they ever have. And corporations are the most profitable than they have ever been. So, it cuts Pell Grants. So they cut Pell Grants too. Sorry, you can't go to school. It turns the SNAP program, which is formerly known as food stamps, into a block grant program, effectively cutting it. And get this. It repeals Obamacare. This would be the 35th bill that was passed that repeals Obamacare. This isn't a budget. It's a wish list. It's like a conservative Christmas list. But there's more. There's always more. It actually reverses the defense cuts from sequestration. So it gives all the money back to the defense contractors. It actually increases defense spending to no less than 4% of GDP. So we're just going to dump more money into defense that we don't know what to do with. So in order to balance the budget, Paul Ryan and the Republicans would need to come up with $6 trillion in cuts because this plan involves no revenue. There's no revenue in this plan. Of course not. And, some of the programs, some of the things that they would cut, they would go into what they call tax expenditures. And that would include some of the popular programs for the middle class, including the mortgage interest deduction. So for homeowners, you get hosed. Well, that's great. And charitable giving. And guess all of these cuts would be used not to balance the budget, but to offset the massive tax cuts to the rich. The whole effect of this budget, that he says we're doing things in a balanced way. We're going to try to balance the budget. It does not balance the budget. It does the opposite. It adds to the deficit. Now, I don't give Bobby Jindal a lot of credit, but he actually said something that was actually not stupid for once. Not stupid for once. He says, quote, and this is about the Ryan budget. He said, quote, "By obsessing with zeros on the budget spreadsheet, we send a not-so-subtle signal that the focus of our country is on the phony economy of Washington, instead of the real economy out here in Charlotte, in Shreveport, in Cheyenne." And now he makes a good point here. Now, the people in Washington are so concerned about debts and deficits, and they don't understand. They're in that, what we call the Beltway bubble. Okay? So they're in that Beltway bubble, and all they understand is, well, obviously we got to shrink the debt, we got to shrink the deficit because business is going to be scared to invest, or they're not going to hire if we have a large national debt, which is bullshit. Okay, there is absolutely no correlation between those, but nonetheless, it's what they like to say. And it's not just it's not just Bobby Jindal that has actually come out against the Ryan budget. There's a New York Times columnist called named Ross, and I'm going to butcher his name, so I apologize, Ross. Ross Douthat. He says, quote, "Moderate deficits are perfectly compatible with fiscal responsibility, and restructuring the biggest drivers of our long-term debt is a much more important conservative goal than holding revenues and outlays equal in the year 2023. What's more, the quest for perfect balance leaves the House GOP officially committed to a weird, all-paying version of Obamonomics." Oh, I love that word. Obamonomics. Which is actually, he's been quite conservative, except for the stimulus, of course. He's been very conservative on fiscal policy. He's actually cut more from the deficit than, well, George Bush. And the deficit has been going down, but I'll get into that later. Anyway, he continues, "In which, for instance, we keep the president's tax increase and Medicare cuts while eliminating his health care law's assistance to the uninsured." Now, of course, the president didn't actually cut Medicare. It was Medicare savings that, by reducing payments, overpayments to providers. So it's not actually Medicare cuts. So I just want to get that straight. And actually, I want to kind of show you a graph about the deficit, showing it's from the Congressional Budget Office, and it basically it's a graph that shows the deficit without the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Bush-era tax cuts, the recovery measures, TARP, and the economic downturn. And it shows how the deficit has fallen, and it also shows the deficit without all of those factors added in. And it shows that it would be very, very low. But of course, all the people say in Washington is that we have a spending problem. No, we have a revenue problem. And we have a spending problem on the wrong people. We spend money on the wrong people and give the wrong people tax cuts, and we give corporations that outsource our jobs overseas, we give them massive tax breaks. But of course, we have a spending problem on old people and the poor, the sick, the uninsured, unemployed, whatever. Even the National Review weighs in on this. In an article, a National Review writer named Ramesh Panuro, I'm butchering these names, and he says, quote, "The choices that Ryan have made have kept Republicans unified, but also reinforced the impression that they are too attuned to the interests of the rich." No shit. No shit, Sherlock. And more concerned with their own obsessions than what the public wants. House Republicans are in danger of becoming like the House Democrats of the early 1980s, secure and comfortable in their power base, and not oriented towards achieving a governing majority. So he's basically agreeing with what I said. This budget is nothing more than a glorified wish list, a Christmas list. It's never going to pass the Senate. It's never going to pass the Senate. It's not going to go anywhere. Just like it hasn't gone anywhere before. But now I want to get into the House progressive budget. Now, you haven't heard a lot about the House progressive budget because it hasn't been shown a lot. It hasn't been talked about a lot. So I want to get into some of the details of the House progressive budget, which was created by the House Progressive Caucus, and it's the direct opposite of the Ryan budget. Now, it was introduced by Senator Patty Murray. And like I said, it was created by the House Progressive Caucus. What it aims to do is that it would reduce the deficit to 2.2% of GDP over the next 10 years. It sounds good. We get deficit reduction. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, there's a mix of spending cuts and revenues, and even some investment. It basically proposes savings in tax expenditures of just under $1 trillion over the next 10 years. And it puts it all towards reducing the deficit. Instead of what the Ryan plan does, is just uses those tax expenditures to pay for tax cuts for the rich. And it creates, it shifts money towards infrastructure, which is very important because that will help create jobs, spur some growth, increase the tax base, and increase demand. It also rolls back the cuts in sequestration. Just rolls them all back. It includes $100 billion of infrastructure spending, which is what I was saying before. It actually reduces defense spending to the levels from 2006. And I'm all in favor of that. It adds a financial transaction tax. So those high-speed Wall Street trades will be taxed, which is great because it's a very, very small tax, but it would raise somewhere around $326 billion over the next 10 years. So that'll help, and I think it's 0.1 cents for every share. It also closes tax loopholes and eliminates tax breaks for oil and gas companies. Oil and gas. I love this. I love this budget already. This looks like a great budget. It also closes the loopholes and eliminates the tax breaks for people on Wall Street and corporations that send jobs overseas. I don't see why we should be giving a tax cut to somebody who ships their job off to China. There's just no reason we should be doing that. It includes an energy carbon tax that will be used to fund alternative energy. So there's some good investment right there. So far you have, infrastructure investment and investment in green energy. No wonder this doesn't make the news. This is an incredibly progressive budget. And Wall Street and the corporations and the mainstream corporate media, they hate this. That's why it never comes up. I'm going to get into that here in a couple of minutes, actually. But continuing with the House progressive budget, something that I would absolutely love to see is that it adds a public option onto health care. I want this budget. All right. A public option, massively progressive, great. I would love to see it get a vote, but it's not going to. And also, it gives the government the power to negotiate drug prices, which of course is one of the factors of the fact that our healthcare costs are rising is because we cannot negotiate with the drug manufacturers. So giving the government the ability to negotiate prices would save billions of dollars. Billions. And it would be a boon for the economy. But, of course, Big Pharma, they don't want to do that. And finally, when it's all said and done, the House progressive budget would reduce the deficit by $4.4 trillion over the next decade. So we'll actually have reduced the deficit, unlike Paul Ryan, where his budget would add to the deficit. So what does the media think about all this? Well, there has been absolutely no mainstream media coverage on any of these, on any news channels that I know of. It just has not been covered. They've all been talking about the Ryan budget, but not talking about the House progressive budget, which I think is an absolute failure of the media. You can even Google the Ryan budget, right? And you'll get 72,000 hits, at least. 72,000 stories. And you got to put it in quotation marks, of course, so that it only searches for those two words. And you'll get 72,000 hits. But if you Google the House progressive back to work budget, you get two results. What is our media doing? It's not doing anything. It's not covering this budget, which is a very progressive, very good budget that actually reduces the deficit and tries to get people back to work. And there are only a few. There are a few news outlets, of course. A lot of the progressive media has latched onto this. The Young Turks, they've mentioned the House progressive budget several times over several different days, as well as Huffington Post, Raw Story, David Pakman. Other progressive outlets have really been wanting to push this budget. But as far as getting it on CNN, no way. The media is an absolute joke. An absolute joke. And it's not funny. Because if people actually knew about the House progressive budget, they would be demanding it. Because a lot of these things, through different polling, of course, a lot of these things would win popular support by both liberals and conservatives. But like I said, it's just another failure of the media. And one more thing I want to cover before I wrap it up is I just want to share the fact that another fact that our media has ignored is the fact that our deficit has been reduced. As a percent of GDP, it's now somewhere around 5%. And in 2014, as long as current laws stay in place, it will actually be down below 4% of GDP. But you don't hear the news talk about that. And I got this information from investors.com, so you can look it up, fact check for yourself, and see that that the deficit has been reduced. And so one thing that I would leave you with is ignore the media spin about our debt crisis. Even John Boehner admitted that we don't have an immediate debt crisis. We don't. It's made up to whip people into a frenzy and to whip Washington into a frenzy so that you will basically allow Washington to cut your Medicare, to cut your food stamps, if you're on them, cut your retirement, your unemployment, basically to allow people like Paul Ryan to come in and eviscerate the safety net and all the programs that help you so we can give tax cuts for the rich. Because that's what it's about. It's about stealing from you and me and giving it to rich people. And that's not right.